Nadia Renner Colquhoun, 38-year-old director of the Colquhoun Family Trust and wife of Brendan, stood at the end of the dining table with her hands flat on the polished oak surface and said nothing. Brendan Colquhoun, 43-year-old chief operating officer of Colquhoun Capital Partners and husband of Nadia, had just slid a manila folder across that same table without looking at her. He adjusted his cufflinks instead. He said the meeting with the lawyers was already scheduled. He said she should have someone review whatever she thought she needed to review. He said it like he was delegating a task at the office. Nadia picked up the folder. Inside was a separation agreement dated 3 weeks earlier. She set it back down. She had made his coffee that morning. She had ironed the collar of the shirt he was wearing right now. She had done these things not out of habit, but because she still believed, 3 weeks ago, that they were building something together. That belief felt, standing in that dining room, like the most embarrassing thing she had ever done. Brendan left for the office. He took his coffee travel mug. He kissed her on the top of the head the way you kiss a child. Then he was gone, and Nadia stood in the kitchen of their home in West Vancouver and listened to the sound of his car backing down the driveway. She had met Brendan when she was 26, just back from 2 years doing financial oversight work for a development NGO in Rwanda. She had been sharp, careful, a little too serious for her age, the kind of woman who read through every contract before she signed it, who asked follow-up questions at every meeting, who kept records of everything. Brendan had been charming in exactly the way she was not. He told stories at dinner parties. He laughed at himself before other people could. He had this quality of making every room feel like a place worth being in. And Nadia had been drawn to that the way people who work in quiet rooms often are. They married when she was 29. She left the NGO work and joined the trust, the Colquhoun Family Trust, established by Brendan's late father, administered for the benefit of Brendan, his younger sister Petra, and the broader charitable endowments attached to the Colquhoun name. Nadia became its director. She was good at it. She was very good at it. She spent 9 years building the trust into something the original documents had barely imagined, a $1.4 billion portfolio that funded early childhood development programs across British Columbia, Alberta, and Nova Scotia. She had done that. Not Brendan. Brendan ran the private equity firm. She ran the trust. She did not fully understand, standing in the kitchen that morning, how important that distinction was about to become. The separation agreement named Danielle Forrest, not by her relationship to Brendan, only by name, as a third party with potential interest in certain shared accounts. Nadia had to read it 3 times before she understood what that meant. She had met Danielle Forrest twice. Once at a firm Christmas party, once at a charity auction the trust had co-sponsored. Danielle was 31, worked in business development at Colquhoun Capital Partners. She had long auburn hair and a firm handshake, and she had told Nadia both times that it was such a pleasure to finally meet her properly. Nadia thought about that word. Finally, she called her sister Renata, who was a family law lawyer in Calgary. Renata said to touch nothing, sign nothing, and get to Vancouver as soon as possible. Renata was on a plane by 7 the next morning. While she waited, Nadia went into her home office and opened her laptop. She had access to the trust's full financial records. That was her job. That was always her job. But she also had, because she was careful and thorough and had been doing this for 9 years, a parallel set of records she maintained herself. Every quarterly report, every board resolution, every disbursement over $10,000. She had started keeping them not out of suspicion but out of professional habit. Now she sat in front of those records at 11:30 at night and started reading. It took her 40 minutes to find the first one. A vendor payment dated 14 months earlier to a consulting firm called Heiress Meridian Solutions, $62,000. The payment had been authorized under a board resolution she did not remember signing. She pulled the resolution. Her signature was on it. She stared at that signature for a long time. She had not signed that document. She opened the next quarter. Another payment, same vendor, different amount. Then a third, then a name change. The vendor became Stratfeld Advisory Group, but the account number receiving the payments was identical. Over 26 months, $340,000 had been moved from the trust's discretionary fund to 2 shell companies that appeared to share a single bank account. She did not sleep that night. Renata arrived the next morning and sat at the kitchen table and listened to everything. Then she looked at the documents and said quietly that they needed to stop calling this a separation and start calling it something else. Nadia asked what she meant. Renata said, "Someone has been forging your signature, and that changes everything." Brendan did not know that Nadia had kept those records. He had always assumed. She understood this later, much later, when she could think about it without her hands shaking. That she was thorough about the trust the way most administrators are thorough, completely, but within a system someone else had designed. He had not considered that she might have built a parallel system of her own. He had not considered it because he did not think that way about her. He had stopped thinking carefully about her a long time ago. That was his first mistake. His second was Danielle Forrest's name in the separation agreement. Danielle had been involved with Brendan for nearly 2 years. Nadia pieced this together not from anything dramatic, but from the ordinary residue of a life shared with someone. A hotel points redemption she didn't recognize, a charge from a florist 2 weeks before she received no flowers, a calendar entry marked DF Whistler that she had assumed at the time was a client meeting. She had not been suspicious. She had been trusting. She had been, she thought now, genuinely foolish, but it was the Whistler entry that connected things. Because Nadia pulled her own travel records from that same weekend. She had been in Halifax at a trust board meeting, and then pulled the trust's credit card statements and found that the hotel in Whistler had been paid on the trust corporate card. Not Brendan's personal card, not the firm's card, the trust card, Nadia's card. The card attached to a charitable endowment. Someone had paid for Brendan Colquhoun's weekend with his mistress, using money that was meant to fund kindergartens. Nadia sat with that for a moment. Then she opened a new spreadsheet. Renata brought in a forensic accountant named Graham Specht, who was based in Toronto and flew out within the week. Graham was methodical and quiet and asked very few questions that weren't about numbers. He sat in the dining room, the same room where Brendan had slid the folder across the table and worked through the trust records for 3 days. What he found was not simple. Brendan had not acted alone. The forged signatures required someone who had access to the trust's administrative files. Nadia was the director, but she did not work alone. There was a small staff, and there was a board, and there was, crucially, an outside firm that handled the trust's compliance documentation. That firm was called Aldermere Group. Brendan's sister, Petra Colquhoun Vance, 40-year-old co-founder of Aldermere Group and sister-in-law of Nadia, sat on Aldermere's executive committee. Nadia had always liked Petra. Petra had been kind to her at family events, thoughtful with birthday gifts, reliable at the kind of small gestures that make a person feel included. Now Nadia thought about all of those gestures and understood that they were the gestures of someone who wanted her close and complacent, not someone who actually cared. Graham pulled Aldermere's compliance submissions going back 4 years. The pattern was there. The forged signatures, the vendor shell companies, the gradual siphoning of discretionary funds. None of it had been reckless. It had been patient and careful, the kind of theft designed to stay invisible across multiple quarterly cycles. Someone who understood financial oversight had designed it. Someone who knew exactly how Nadia worked had built it around her habits. That someone, Graham said, was almost certainly 2 people working together. Nadia already knew their names. She had them on a spreadsheet. What Nadia did not do was call Brendan. She thought about it. She imagined that conversation many times in those first 10 days. What she would say, what he would say, whether there was any version of it that ended with something that resembled the truth. She always arrived at the same conclusion. There wasn't. Brendan had stopped being honest with her so gradually that she could not identify the moment it happened. He would not be honest now. He would manage her. He would tell her she was misreading things. He would be, as he had always been, very good at making a room feel like a place worth being in. She did not want to be in that room anymore. What she did instead was call the trust's board of independent directors. There were 3 of them, 2 retired federal judges and a former deputy minister of finance. And she called each of them privately, sent them a summary document Graham had prepared, and asked for an emergency board meeting. All 3 agreed within 24 hours. The meeting was held at a law office in downtown Vancouver, not at the trust offices. Nadia arrived early. Brendan did not know the meeting was happening. She presented for 90 minutes. She was not emotional. She had spent 9 years presenting to boards, and she knew how to be clear and precise and credible. And she was all of those things. She walked them through the vendor shell companies, the forged signatures, the Aldermere compliance records, the credit card statements. She showed them the Whistler receipts. She showed them the original trust documents that made her, not Brendan, the sole administrative authority over the discretionary fund. One of the retired judges, a woman named the Honourable Margaret Theus, asked one question when Nadia finished. Had anyone else seen these records? Nadia said, "My forensic accountant, my sister, and now you." Margaret Theus nodded once and looked at the other 2 board members. They voted to freeze all trust accounts pending investigation before Nadia had finished putting her papers back in her folder. Brendan found out 2 days later when his personal credit card, which drew on a line of credit secured against trust assets, was declined at a restaurant in Yaletown. He called Nadia. She did not answer. He called Renata by mistake. because Renata's name came right before Nadia's in his contacts, and Renata answered and said, very calmly, that he should speak with his lawyer. He showed up at the house that evening. Nadia was there. Renata was there. Graham Specht was there, which Brendan had not expected, and the presence of a forensic accountant in his own dining room seemed to briefly unhinge him in a way the frozen accounts had not. He said there was an explanation. Nadia said she would like to hear it. He said the vendor payments were for legitimate consulting work that had never been properly documented, but that had genuinely benefited the trust. Nadia asked him to name one specific deliverable from Harwick Meridian Solutions. He couldn't. She asked him to explain the forged signatures. He said she must have signed those documents and forgotten. She asked him to explain the Whistler Hotel on the trust credit card. He said, nothing. The room was very quiet. Outside it was raining, a steady Vancouver February rain that made the windows run with water. Nadia had lived in this house for 7 years. She had repainted the dining room twice, chosen the light fixture above the table, planted the garden outside the window that was now bare and winter grey. She knew every corner of this house, and she understood, sitting in it now, that she was going to leave it, and that was fine. She had built things before. She would build them again. Brendan left without saying anything else. Petra was harder. Nadia had not disliked many people in her life. She was not built for sustained dislike. It required a kind of ongoing attention she preferred to spend elsewhere. But Petra's particular betrayal had a texture that Brendan's did not. Brendan had wanted something and had taken it without thinking about her. Petra had been deliberate. Petra had designed it. Aldermere Group was served with a civil fraud notice 3 weeks after the board meeting. Petra called Nadia before the notice was even formally delivered. She must have had someone watching, or someone inside. She said she wanted to talk. She said it had all been Brendan's idea. She said she had been trying to protect the trust the same as Nadia had. Nadia listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "You forged my signature on documents that transferred charitable funds to accounts you controlled. There is nothing you can say to me about that." She hung up. She did not cry. She had expected to, had braced for it, actually, the way you brace for a wave when you can see it coming. But the wave didn't arrive. She felt instead something quieter and more useful, a very specific clarity about what had happened and what she intended to do about it. The investigation ran for 4 months. Graham coordinated with a forensic audit firm retained by the board. The RCMP Financial Crimes Unit was notified. Nadia cooperated with everything, answered every question, provided every document she had kept in her parallel records. What the investigation found in full was this: $847,000 had been moved out of the trust's discretionary and operational accounts over a period of 31 months. Of that, approximately $340,000 had gone to the 2 shell vendor companies traced to accounts held jointly by Brendan and Petra. The remaining $507,000 had been used for personal expenses. The Whistler trip was the smallest item, run through a secondary account at Aldermere that the compliance submissions had never disclosed. Brendan's lawyers attempted at various points during those 4 months to reframe the story. He had been misled by Petra. He had signed things without reading them. He had trusted his sister's professional judgment too completely. Petra's lawyers said the opposite. They spent considerable energy pointing at each other, which Nadia found clarifying, if not surprising. What neither of them attempted to address was the trust itself, because the trust had not been built for Brendan. His father had designed it, carefully, with the advice of people who understood that second-generation wealth requires protection from the people it benefits. Nadia had read those founding documents so many times she could quote passages from memory. She had built a portfolio on top of them, and more importantly, she had served as the legal administrative authority from the day she was appointed. The trust, after the accounts were unfrozen and the independent board had completed its review, remained exactly where it had been. The programs continued. The disbursements resumed. The kindergartens were funded. Nadia remained director. The separation was finalized in October. The house in West Vancouver was sold. Nadia took an apartment in Kitsilano, the 3rd floor of a building that looked out over the water, and she liked it better than she expected to. She did not attend the court proceedings related to the fraud case. Her lawyers attended on her behalf. She was told in July of the following year that both Brendan and Petra had pled guilty to charges of breach of fiduciary trust and fraud over $5,000. The sentences were delivered on a Tuesday morning while Nadia was in Halifax for a trust board meeting. She read the summary her lawyer sent on her phone between the morning session and lunch. Brendan received 18 months to be served in the community with conditions. Petra received 22 months, plus restitution. Danielle Forrest had not been charged with anything. She had not known, the investigation found, where Brendan's money came from. Nadia thought about that for a moment, then put her phone away and went to lunch. There had been, early in the process, a settlement offer. Brendan's lawyers had presented it through Renata, a full and mutual release, a financial package, and an agreement that Nadia would step down as trust director to be replaced by an independent appointee. The offer was structured to sound reasonable. It came with a cover letter that used the word closure 3 times. Nadia had declined it in a single sentence. She was not interested in closure. She was interested in the truth. That had always been the distinction, she thought, between people who build things and people who simply move through them. Brendan had moved through her life. Petra had moved through the trust. They had taken what was easy and left the complicated parts for someone else to manage. Nadia had always been that someone else. She had managed the complicated parts for 9 years, and she intended to keep doing it. The Colquhoun Family Trust held its annual gala in November of that year. It was held at the Vancouver Convention Centre, overlooking the harbour. 460 people attended. The programs the trust funded had, over the prior 12 months, served 11,000 children in 3 provinces. Nadia stood at the podium in a navy dress she had bought in Halifax and gave a 12-minute speech that she had written herself, without notes, over 2 evenings in her kitchen in Kitsilano. She talked about the founding principles of the trust. She talked about what the programs meant to the families who used them. She talked, briefly, about resilience. Not the inspirational poster kind, she said, but the ordinary kind. The kind that looks like showing up and doing the work even when the people around you have stopped deserving your effort. The room was quiet when she finished. Then it wasn't. She thanked the board. She thanked the staff. She thanked the donors who had stayed. She did not mention Brendan. She did not mention Petra. She did not mention Danielle Forrest or Harik Meridian Solutions or the Whistler Hotel or the separation agreement that had been slid across the dining table on a Tuesday morning, while she still believed she was building something with someone who was worth building with. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room already knew. And the ones who didn't would find out soon enough. The truth had a way of arriving on its own schedule, unhurried and complete, long after the people who tried to bury it had already moved on to the next thing they were trying to take.